5,000 men walked into the mist and never came back. They were not ordinary men. They were Rome's finest soldiers. The Ninth Legion, battle-tested warriors who had crushed rebellions from Spain to Germania, men who feared nothing. But something in the wild lands of northern Britain made them disappear. Completely. Without a trace. No battle was ever recorded. No bodies were ever found. No survivor ever told the tale. The golden eagle that led them into the Highland mist was never seen again. Rome, the greatest empire in history, simply pretended they had never existed. Tonight, we follow their footsteps into the Scottish Highlands. We trace the cold trail of evidence that historians have been following for 2,000 years. We dig into the archaeological clues that suggest something terrible happened in those misty mountains. The answer may still be buried in the ancient earth, scattered across hidden battlefields, waiting in mass graves that modern science is only now beginning to find. This is the story of the greatest military mystery in Roman history. The story of 5,000 soldiers who walked into legend and never returned. To understand why their disappearance shocked the Roman world, you need to know what the Ninth Legion really was. They weren't just soldiers. They were legends walking. The Ninth Legion was born in blood and glory during Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul. Picture the year 65 BCE. Caesar is carving his way through the Celtic tribes of France and Belgium. He needs troops who can handle the worst fighting. Men who won't break when the barbarians come screaming out of the forests. So he creates the Ninth Legion. Recruits from across the Roman territories. Veterans from other units. Young men hungry for glory and gold. He forges them into a weapon that will serve Rome for the next 170 years. These men learn to fight in the forests of Gaul. They master the art of mountain warfare in the Spanish Highlands. They perfect siege tactics in the Germanic campaigns. By the time they reach Britain, they've seen more combat than most armies see in a lifetime. Let me paint you a picture of what a Roman legionary looked like in those days. 6 feet of muscle and scars. Armor that weighs 60 pounds but moves like a second skin. A short sword designed for close quarters killing. A shield that can stop a charging horse. But it's not just the equipment. It's the training. From the moment they join the Legion, these men eat, sleep, and breathe war. They march 20 miles a day in full armor. They build fortified camps every single night, even on friendly territory. They practice sword work until their hands bleed. Most importantly, they learn to fight as one. The Roman battle formation is a machine. When it works properly, it's unstoppable. Shields locked together like a moving wall. Spears bristling like a porcupine. Every man knowing exactly where he needs to be and what he needs to do. The Ninth Legion perfected this machine over decades of warfare. They fought in Spain, where the mountain tribes were tough as nails and knew every cave and valley. They learned to adapt, to improvise, to win battles that should have been impossible. When they earned the title Hispana, the Spanish Legion, it wasn't just a name. It was a badge of honor. These were the men who had tamed the wildest warriors in Europe. So when Emperor Claudius decided to conquer Britain in 43 CE, the Ninth Legion was an obvious choice. They landed on the beaches of Kent with 5,000 men in perfect fighting order. Veterans who had never lost a real battle. Professionals who expected to turn Britain into just another Roman province. At first, everything went according to plan. The southern British tribes fought bravely, but they couldn't match Roman discipline and equipment. The Ninth Legion carved through enemy armies like a sword through silk. They built roads. They built forts. They turned enemy warriors into Roman citizens. Within 20 years, it looked like Britain was pacified. The wild island was becoming civilized. Roman law replaced tribal custom. Roman coins replaced barter. Roman gods joined the local pantheon. The Ninth Legion established their main base at Lindum Colonia, modern Lincoln. A perfect Roman fortress with stone walls, proper sewers, and heated barracks. The kind of place that showed the locals what civilization looked like. Veterans retired and married local women. Children grew up speaking Latin alongside their native tongues. British nobles sent their sons to Rome for education. It was the standard pattern of Roman conquest. Resistance, defeat, integration, prosperity. The Ninth Legion was proud of their work. They'd done what Romans always did. They'd brought order to chaos, light to darkness, civilization to barbarians. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd started to believe their own propaganda. They thought Britain was conquered. They thought the natives were tamed. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Her name was Boudica. In the British tongue, it meant victory. She was a queen of the Iceni tribe, in what we now call Norfolk. Her husband, Prasutagus, had been a client king, a British ruler who worked with Rome instead of against it. It was a common arrangement in the early days of conquest. Local kings kept their thrones as long as they followed Roman orders and paid Roman taxes. Their children were often taken to Rome as guests, hostages, really, to ensure good behavior. Prasutagus played the game well. He grew rich under Roman protection. His people prospered. When he died in 60 CE, he left half his kingdom to the Roman emperor and half to his daughters. A careful balance that should have kept everyone happy. But Rome had other ideas. The moment Prasutagus was buried, Roman tax collectors arrived. They didn't want half the kingdom. They wanted it all. They claimed Prasutagus's debts were higher than his estate. They demanded immediate payment in cash. When Boudica protested, they had her publicly flogged. When her daughters tried to intervene, the Romans violated them. In front of the entire tribe. In front of everyone who had believed that cooperation with Rome would keep their families safe. It was the worst mistake the Romans ever made in Britain. Boudica didn't just get angry. She got organized. She sent messengers to every tribe in eastern England. Not just the Iceni, but the Trinovants, the Catavellani, dozens of smaller clans. All of them with their own grievances against Rome. All of them waiting for someone to light the fuse. The message was simple: drive the Romans into the sea. Kill every man, woman, and child who had collaborated with the invaders. Burn every Roman building. Destroy every trace of the occupation. Make Britain free again. The response was overwhelming. Warriors poured in from across the region. Not just the usual young hotheads, but veteran fighters. Men who remembered the old ways. Women who wanted revenge for their own violated daughters. Within weeks, Boudica commanded an army of over 100,000 warriors, the largest force ever assembled in Britain. Meanwhile, the Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was busy conquering the island of Anglesey in Wales. He'd taken most of the Roman forces with him, leaving Britain's eastern regions defended by scattered garrisons and auxiliary troops. The 9th Legion was at their base in Lincoln, 120 miles from the rebellion's center. When the first reports arrived, their commander, Quintus Petilius Cerealis, wasn't particularly worried. British rebellions happened all the time. They usually collapsed within a few weeks once the Romans showed up in force. A few executions, some burned villages, and everything would go back to normal. Cerealis had good reason for confidence. The 9th Legion had never lost a real battle. They were professional soldiers facing what looked like an undisciplined mob. Even if the Britons had superior numbers, Roman training and equipment should carry the day. So when orders came to march south and relieve the Roman colony at Camulodunum, modern Colchester, Cerealis moved his men out quickly. 5,000 legionaries plus auxiliary cavalry. More than enough firepower to crush any British uprising. The march south should have taken 3 days. The roads were good. The weather was clear. The men were in high spirits, joking about the easy victory ahead. But Boudica's warriors were already moving. They knew the Roman roads better than the Romans did. They knew exactly where Cerealis would march and when he would arrive. More importantly, they knew where to set their trap. The attack came somewhere near modern Peterborough. The exact location is still debated by historians, but the result was clear. Boudica's forces surrounded the Roman column in dense woodland where the legionaries couldn't form proper battle lines. What happened next was a slaughter. British war chariots thundered out of hidden positions. Warriors painted with blue woad poured from the trees. War cries in a dozen different languages echoed through the forest. The neat Roman formations shattered like pottery. This wasn't the disciplined warfare the Romans were used to. No neat battle lines. No honorable single combat. No mercy for the wounded. British warriors fought like demons, driven by years of accumulated rage. They had specific targets. The officers first, the men with the fancy armor and horsehair plumes. Then the standard bearers, the men who carried the legion's sacred eagles. Finally, anyone who looked like they might escape to tell the tale. The 9th Legion fought back with the skill and courage of professional soldiers. But they were outnumbered 5 to 1, cut off from their supplies, fighting in terrain that favored their enemies. Most crucially, they were unprepared for the sheer hatred they faced. These weren't rebels fighting for political advantage. These were people fighting for their homes, their families, their way of life. People who would rather die than live under Roman rule. The battle lasted from dawn until sunset. By the end, most of the 9th Legion was dead, scattered across several miles of British woodland, their blood feeding the oak trees they'd tried to conquer. Only the cavalry escaped, a few hundred horsemen who could outrun the British war chariots. They rode south with news that would shake the Roman world. The mighty 9th Legion had been destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. Wiped off the face of the earth by barbarian savages. The news got worse. While Cerealis and his men were dying in the woods, Boudicca's main army was burning its way across eastern England. Camulodunum fell in hours. London was evacuated just before the rebels arrived. Verulamium, modern St. Albans, was reduced to ash and rubble. According to the historian Tacitus, 70,000 Romans and Roman allies died in the uprising. Every man, woman, and child who had cooperated with the occupation. Every merchant who had traded with Rome. Every Briton who had adopted Roman ways. It was ethnic cleansing on a massive scale. A deliberate attempt to erase every trace of Roman civilization from British soil. For a few terrifying weeks, it looked like the conquest of Britain was over. The province would have to be abandoned. The legions would retreat to Gaul, leaving the island to its ancient gods and tribal ways. But Rome doesn't stay defeated. Suetonius Paulinus rushed back from Wales with every available soldier. Reinforcements arrived from Germany and Gaul. Fresh legions landed on British beaches. The final battle came somewhere in the English Midlands. Boudicca's massive army faced 2 Roman legions in open ground. It should have been close. The numbers were fairly even. The British warriors were battle-tested and highly motivated. But the Romans had learned from their defeats. They chose the ground carefully. They used their cavalry wisely. Most importantly, they fought with the cold fury of professional soldiers who had seen their comrades butchered. When the British charge broke against Roman shields, the slaughter was terrible. Boudicca's army disintegrated. Tens of thousands of warriors died trying to escape the Roman pursuit. The rebellion was crushed with such force that eastern England didn't dare revolt again for centuries. Boudicca herself died in the aftermath. Some say she took poison rather than face capture. Others claim she died of illness. Either way, the woman who had nearly driven Rome from Britain was gone. But so was the 9th Legion. Of the 5,000 men who had marched south to face the rebellion, fewer than 500 had survived. The rest were scattered across British battlefields, their bones picked clean by ravens. For most military units, that would have been the end. But Rome doesn't abandon its legions easily. Within months, the rebuilding began. Fresh recruits from Spain and Italy, veterans transferred from other legions. New equipment, new training. By 70 CE, the 9th Legion was back to full strength. 5,000 men again, ready for war. Based in a new fortress at Eboracum, the place we now call York. They had learned their lesson. Never underestimate the British. Never assume the natives were truly conquered. Never march into unknown territory without proper reconnaissance. But most importantly, never forget that Britain was a land that could swallow Roman legions whole. A place where mist and forest could hide armies. Where ancient gods still demanded blood sacrifice. The rebuilt 9th Legion would serve honorably for the next 40 years. They would help build Hadrian's Wall. They would fight successful campaigns across northern England. They would become, once again, one of Rome's premier military units. But they would never entirely escape the shadow of that first disaster. The knowledge that British warriors could destroy even the finest Roman troops. The understanding that beyond the frontier lay enemies who fought with a fury that civilized men could barely comprehend. That knowledge should have kept them safe, should have made them cautious. It didn't. The rebuilt 9th Legion was different from its predecessor. Harder, more careful, tempered by the knowledge that British warriors could kill Roman soldiers just as easily as Roman soldiers could kill British warriors. Their new fortress at York was a marvel of military engineering. Massive stone walls that could withstand any siege. Barracks that could house 6,000 men in comfort. Workshops for maintaining equipment. Hospitals for treating the wounded. Everything a professional army needed to project power across hostile territory. But it wasn't just the physical infrastructure that had changed. The men themselves were different. Veterans of the Boudica Rebellion mixed with fresh recruits from across the empire. Spanish mountain fighters. German forest warriors. Gauls who understood Celtic tactics. They trained constantly. Mock battles in the Yorkshire countryside. Forced marches in full armor. Night attacks on practice fortifications. The Legion commanders were determined that their men would never again be caught unprepared. The training paid off. For the next 40 years, the 9th Legion was involved in every major campaign in northern Britain. They were the tip of the spear in Rome's push toward Scotland. The iron fist that kept the northern tribes in line. Under the governor Agricola, they helped conquer most of what we now call Scotland. The great victory at Mons Graupius in 84 CE broke the back of Caledonian resistance. 30,000 tribal warriors faced the Roman war machine in open battle. It was a slaughter. The tribes fled into the mountains, leaving their dead scattered across the Highland moors. The 9th Legion was there, shoulder to shoulder with the other legions. Shields locked, swords bloody, professional soldiers doing what they did best. For a brief moment, it looked like all of Britain would fall under Roman rule. From the English Channel to the Northern Islands, the empire's authority would be absolute. Tribal warfare would be replaced by Roman law. Local gods would make room for Roman deities. The wild island would become just another civilized province. But Rome's attention was turning elsewhere. Problems on the German frontier. Unrest in the east. The Emperor Domitian recalled Agricola and most of his legions. The conquest of Scotland was put on hold. The 9th Legion found themselves manning a frontier instead of extending one. They built forts along the Forth Clyde line. They trained auxiliary troops recruited from friendly tribes. They kept watch on the unconquered territories to the north. It should have been a peaceful assignment. The great tribal confederations had been broken. The Highland clans were too busy fighting each other to threaten Roman territory. The frontier was stable. But frontiers are never really stable. They're bleeding wounds that never quite heal. And beyond the Roman lines, something was stirring. The Picts were different from the southern tribes that Rome had conquered. They lived in the harsh landscapes of the far north, where winter lasted half the year and the mountains could kill the unwary. They were harder people, more savage, less inclined to submit to foreign rule. More importantly, they had been watching, learning, studying Roman tactics and Roman weaknesses. 50 years of border skirmishes had taught them things that Boudica's warriors never knew. They learned that Roman cavalry was vulnerable in broken terrain, that Roman supply lines could be cut by small, fast-moving forces, that Roman discipline broke down when soldiers were separated from their comrades. Most crucially, they learned patience. Boudica had gathered a massive army and attacked immediately. The Picts were willing to wait, to plan, to strike only when victory was certain. By the late 1st century CE, Pictish raiders were becoming a serious problem. They would slip across the frontier in small groups, attack isolated Roman outposts, ambush supply convoys, kill sentries, and disappear back into the Highland mist. The raids were carefully planned. The Picts avoided major Roman bases where the legions could respond in force. They struck at auxiliary units and local militias. They targeted the softest, most vulnerable parts of the Roman frontier. The 9th Legion found themselves constantly responding to these attacks. A fort burned here, a convoy ambushed there, always arriving just too late to catch the raiders, always finding empty hills where Pictish warriors should have been. It was frustrating warfare, the kind that wears down even professional soldiers. The Romans were used to decisive battles where superior training and equipment carried the day. This was different. This was a war of shadows and ambushes, a war where the enemy chose when and where to fight. Still, the 9th Legion adapted. They learned to move faster, to think like raiders instead of like a conventional army. They started their own guerrilla campaigns, striking at Pictish settlements beyond the frontier. For 20 years, this border war continued. Neither side could deliver a decisive blow. The Romans couldn't pin down the Pictish raiders long enough to destroy them. The Picts couldn't gather enough warriors to threaten major Roman positions. It was a stalemate, the kind of conflict that could continue indefinitely as long as both sides were willing to accept the casualties. But around 105 CE, something changed. The raids became more frequent, more aggressive, more coordinated. Intelligence reports suggested that the Pictish tribes were uniting under a single war leader, someone who understood both Roman weaknesses and Pictish strengths. The signs were there for anyone willing to read them. weapons caches discovered in abandoned settlements, war bands spotted moving through areas that should have been empty, messages intercepted between tribal leaders. The Picts were planning something big, not random raids, but a coordinated campaign, an attempt to drive the Romans back across Hadrian's Wall and reclaim the Scottish lowlands for the tribes. The governor of Britain was Marcus Atilius Bradua, a competent administrator but no military genius. He had two choices: reinforce the frontier with troops from the south, or launch a preemptive strike to disrupt Pictish preparations. He chose the strike. In 108 CE, orders went out to the 9th Legion. March north, find the Pictish army, destroy it before it could threaten Roman territory, show the barbarians that Rome still ruled Britain. It was exactly the kind of mission the 9th Legion had been training for, a chance to use their superior discipline and equipment against tribal warriors, a chance to end the border war once and for all. The Legion marched out of York in perfect order, 5,000 men in gleaming armor, veterans and recruits united in common purpose. The Golden Eagle catching the morning sun as it led them north toward enemy territory. Local civilians watched them go. Another campaign, another victory. The boys would be back by winter with stories and loot. Business as usual for the most professional army in the world. But this time was different. This time, the enemy was ready. This time, the trap had been waiting for 40 years to close. The 9th Legion marched north into Scottish history. They left behind all the certainties of Roman civilization. The straight roads, the orderly camps, the predictable rhythms of garrison life. They were heading into a land where different rules applied, where the mist could hide armies, where ancient gods still demanded blood sacrifice, where Celtic warriors had been preparing for half a century to make Romans pay for their conquest. The men of the 9th Legion had no way of knowing they were marching to their deaths. They were confident, professional, battle-tested. They had every reason to believe they would crush whatever opposition they met. But confidence can be a weakness. Professionalism can become rigidity. And sometimes, the most battle-tested armies are the ones least prepared for a completely new kind of war. Somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, 5,000 Roman soldiers were about to discover that they weren't as invincible as they thought. The last confirmed sighting of the 9th Legion was at Trimontium, modern Melrose, just north of Hadrian's Wall. A Roman outpost commander recorded their passage in his daily log. 5,000 men in good order, morale high, equipment in perfect condition. They were following the Old Deer Street, the Roman road that ran north through the Scottish borders. It was the main military highway into Caledonia, built by Agricola's engineers during the conquest campaigns 20 years earlier. The road was solid Roman engineering, stone foundations, proper drainage, straight as an arrow wherever possible. The kind of infrastructure that allowed Roman armies to move quickly through hostile territory. But roads are double-edged weapons. They allow armies to move fast, but they also make those armies predictable. Everyone knows where a road goes. Everyone knows where the bridges are, where the passes narrow, where an army would have to slow down. The Picts had been studying this road for decades. They knew every mile of it, every strategic point, every place where a Roman column would be vulnerable. From Trimontium, the 9th Legion would have marched northwest toward the Eildon Hills. Rolling country, mostly open, where Roman cavalry could operate effectively. The kind of terrain that favored conventional tactics. But as they moved deeper into Scotland, the landscape changed. The hills grew steeper, the forests thicker, the valleys narrower. Perfect guerrilla warfare country, where small forces could defeat much larger ones. The Picts let them come. Watchers hidden in the hills counted the Roman numbers. Messengers carried word to tribal leaders scattered across the highlands. The trap was almost ready. Modern archaeologists have tried to trace the 9th Legion's route beyond Trimontium. It's detective work of the highest order, looking for camps that Roman engineers would have built, searching for artifacts dropped along the march route, following the logic of military movement in hostile territory. The evidence suggests the Legion made it at least as far as the Lammermuir Hills, maybe 50 miles north of Hadrian's Wall. Roman military equipment from the early 2nd century has been found in this area. Helmet fragments, belt fittings, pieces of armor. But the finds are scattered, isolated, not the kind of dense artifact fields you'd expect from a major Roman base or battlefield. More like the debris an army leaves behind when it's moving fast through enemy territory. Beyond the Lammermuirs, the trail goes cold. No more Roman artifacts. No more evidence of organized military movement. It's as if the earth simply swallowed 5,000 men. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The Scottish Highlands are vast. Much of the terrain has never been properly surveyed by archaeologists. And Highland weather is harsh on ancient remains. Artifacts that might survive for centuries in dry climates can dissolve in decades of Scottish rain and frost. Still, the pattern is suggestive. The 9th Legion appears to have made steady progress for the first 50 miles of their march. Then something happened. Something that scattered them. Something that left only fragments behind. To understand what that something might have been, you need to think like a Pictish war leader planning an ambush. First, choose your ground carefully. You want terrain that forces the Romans to bunch up. Narrow valleys where their cavalry can't maneuver. Forest paths where their formations can't deploy. Mountain passes where they have to string out in a long, vulnerable column. Second, coordinate your forces. This isn't a job for a single tribe. You need warriors from across the Highlands. Men who can move through rough country like ghosts. Who can strike fast and disappear faster. Third, be patient. Let the Romans get deep into hostile territory. Far from their bases. Far from reinforcements. Far from any hope of rescue. The Pictish plan was probably simple in concept, but devastating in execution. Let the 9th Legion march deep into the Highlands. String them out along mountain paths where they couldn't form proper battle lines. Then hit them from all sides at once. The attack would have come without warning. One moment, the Romans would be marching through empty Highland landscape. The next, the hills would be alive with screaming warriors. Painted Picts pouring down from hidden positions. War cries echoing off the mountain walls. Arrows and spears filling the air like deadly rain. Confusion and terror spreading through the Roman ranks as their neat formations disintegrated. The Romans would have tried to form defensive positions. These were professional soldiers. They'd been trained for exactly this kind of situation. But training is one thing. Reality is another. In the narrow Highland passes, Roman discipline would have worked against them. Soldiers trained to stay in formation would have been unable to adapt to fluid, chaotic combat. Officers shouting orders that couldn't be heard over the din of battle. Standard procedures that didn't work in impossible terrain. The Picts, meanwhile, would have been in their element. Fighting in country they'd known since childhood. Using weapons and tactics perfected over generations of tribal warfare. Moving like wolves through landscape that was foreign and hostile to their enemies. The battle probably wasn't a single engagement, but a series of running fights spread across dozens of miles. Roman units cut off from the main column. Officers killed. Communications broken. The legion dissolving into smaller and smaller groups as Pictish pressure mounted. Some Romans might have fought their way out of the initial ambush. Veterans with enough experience to adapt to changing conditions. Small groups who managed to stay together and find defensible positions. But they would have been deep in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile tribes, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. Even if they survived the first attack, they would have faced a slow death from starvation, exposure, and constant harassment. The Picts would have hunted them relentlessly, tracking them through the Highlands like animals, picking off stragglers, attacking camps at night, making it impossible for any significant Roman force to escape. One by one, the survivors would have been worn down, killed in small skirmishes, captured and executed, lost in the Highland wilderness, until none were left to carry word back to York. The final act would have been the capture of the legion's golden eagle, the sacred standard that represented Roman honor and divine approval. In Pictish hands, it would have become a trophy of the greatest military victory in British history. The destruction of the 9th Legion would have sent shockwaves through the Highland tribes. Proof that Rome could be beaten, that the empire wasn't invincible, that British warriors could still defend their homeland against foreign invaders. But there would have been no survivors to carry the news south, no messengers to warn other Roman forces. The 9th Legion simply vanished into the Highland mist, leaving behind only silence and scattered artifacts. At York, the garrison would have waited for word from the north. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Still no reports from the 9th Legion. No prisoners. No refugees. No sign that 5,000 Roman soldiers had ever existed. Eventually, the truth would have become undeniable. The 9th Legion was gone. not defeated in battle, but erased from existence, swallowed by the Scottish Highlands without leaving a trace. Rome's response was swift and decisive. The legion's name was struck from the records. Their number was never used again. Their history was quietly forgotten. It was as if 5,000 soldiers had never lived at all. But forgetting doesn't make the truth disappear. Somewhere in the Highland mist, the evidence remains, scattered across ancient battlefields, hidden in mass graves, waiting for modern archaeology to tell the final chapter of their story. For nearly 2,000 years, the fate of the Ninth Legion remained a mystery. Roman writers were silent on the subject. Medieval chroniclers had other concerns. The story survived only in fragments and whispers. But in the 19th century, something changed. Archaeology was becoming a science. Scholars were learning to read the landscape like a book, to find stories buried in the earth that written records had forgotten. The search for the Ninth Legion began in earnest. Early investigators focused on the most obvious approach, following the old Roman roads north from York. If the Legion had marched into Scotland, they would have left traces, camps, artifacts, some physical evidence of their passage. The first major discovery came in 1854. Workers digging a railway cutting near Melrose uncovered a cache of Roman military equipment. Swords, spear points, pieces of armor, all dating to the early 2nd century CE. The find was exciting but frustrating. The equipment was scattered, suggesting it had been abandoned rather than lost in battle. But why would Roman soldiers abandon perfectly good weapons? And where were the soldiers themselves? More discoveries followed over the next century. Roman artifacts turning up in Highland locations where no Roman army was supposed to have been. Military equipment found in Pictish settlements. Coins and personal items scattered across Scottish battlefields. Each find added a piece to the puzzle. But the picture remained incomplete. Tantalizing hints of a Roman presence in the far north, but no clear evidence of what had happened to the men who left those artifacts behind. The breakthrough came with the development of modern archaeological techniques. Ground-penetrating radar, aerial photography, scientific dating methods, tools that could see beneath the surface of the landscape. In 1972, a team from Edinburgh University began a systematic survey of potential battlefield sites in the Scottish borders. They were looking for evidence of the border wars between Romans and Picts. Mass graves, weapon scatters, burned layers from destroyed settlements. What they found was more than they'd bargained for. The first site was near Jedburgh, just north of Hadrian's Wall. Radar scans revealed anomalies in the soil, rectangular patterns that looked like organized burial pits, the kind of thing you'd expect to find after a major battle. Excavation confirmed the radar findings. Mass graves containing dozens of bodies. Men aged 20 to 40, many showing signs of violent death. Sword cuts, spear wounds, skull fractures from blunt weapons. But these weren't Pictish warriors. The bone analysis suggested Mediterranean origins. The dental work was consistent with Roman military standards. The grave goods included Roman military equipment. Carbon dating placed the burials in the early 2nd century CE, the exact time when the Ninth Legion disappeared. More sites followed. A burial ground near Kelso with similar characteristics. Another near Hoyk, each containing Roman remains from the same time period, each suggesting a military disaster on a massive scale. The most significant discovery came in 1985, a hill fort near the town of Peebles that showed clear signs of having been attacked and destroyed in the early 2nd century. The burn layer contained Roman artifacts mixed with Pictish weapons, evidence of a battle fought between Romans and natives. But the most telling detail was what wasn't found. No Roman victory monuments. No signs of Roman occupation after the battle. This wasn't a Roman victory followed by construction of a new fort. This was a Roman defeat followed by abandonment of the site. Further north, in the heart of the Scottish Highlands, other evidence was emerging. Roman military equipment found in contexts that didn't match the official historical record. Weapons and armor in Highland locations where Roman armies were never supposed to have been. The most intriguing finds came from Pictish sites, hill forts and settlement areas where Roman artifacts appeared alongside native material. Not trade goods or diplomatic gifts, but military equipment. Swords, armor, the kind of thing that changes hands only in battle. Some of these artifacts showed signs of having been reworked. Roman swords turned into Celtic weapons. armor plates used to make tools, the behavior of victorious warriors taking trophies from defeated enemies. But the smoking gun remained elusive. Clear proof that the 9th Legion had been destroyed in Scotland required finding their camp, their battlefield, their mass grave. The search continued into the 21st century. New technologies offered new possibilities. Satellite imagery, LiDAR scanning, metal detectors capable of finding artifacts buried for millennia. In 2003, a team from Glasgow University announced a major discovery. LiDAR scans of the Scottish Highlands had revealed what appeared to be a Roman marching camp near the town of Aberfoyle. The right size for a legion, the right date, in exactly the kind of location where you'd expect to find the 9th Legion's final position. Excavation began immediately. What they found was both exciting and puzzling. Clear evidence of Roman military occupation, a camp laid out according to standard legion specifications. Artifacts consistent with early 2nd century dating, but also signs of violence, hasty abandonment, equipment left behind in circumstances that suggested emergency evacuation, and burn layers indicating the camp had been destroyed by fire. Most significantly, the excavation revealed evidence of a siege. Defensive earthworks that had been hastily constructed around the camp perimeter. Arrow points scattered across the defensive lines. Clear signs that the Romans had been under attack for an extended period. The picture that emerged was chilling. The 9th Legion had made it deep into Highland territory. They'd built a standard marching camp according to regulation procedures. But then something had gone wrong. Terribly wrong. The Picts had found them, surrounded them, cut them off from escape routes and supply lines. What followed was a siege that the Romans had no hope of winning. Trapped in enemy territory, outnumbered, running low on food and water, the 9th Legion would have fought with the desperate courage of professional soldiers facing certain death. But courage alone wouldn't have been enough. Not against an enemy that knew every hill and valley. Not in terrain that favored defenders over attackers. Not when rescue was impossible and retreat was blocked. The end would have come quickly once the Pictish assault began in earnest. Wooden palisades burning, Roman formations breaking under overwhelming pressure, officers falling as Pictish arrows found their marks. In the final moments, small groups of legionaries would have fought back to back, veterans and recruits united in common cause, selling their lives as dearly as possible, making the barbarians pay for every inch of Roman ground. But it wouldn't have mattered. The outcome was inevitable from the moment the Picts closed their trap. 5,000 Roman soldiers were going to die in the Scottish Highlands. Die far from home, die forgotten and unmourned. The archaeological evidence suggests that some Romans might have escaped the initial massacre. Small groups who broke through Pictish lines during the confusion of the final assault. Men who fled into the Highland wilderness hoping to reach Roman territory. But the Picts would have hunted them down, tracked them through forests and across moors, killed them one by one in lonely glens where no one would ever find their bones. Metal detector surveys in the years following the Aberfoyle discovery have turned up Roman artifacts scattered across hundreds of square miles of Highland territory. Weapons dropped by fleeing soldiers. Personal items abandoned during desperate flights through enemy country. Each find tells part of the story. A Roman sword found near Loch Lomond. Armor fragments discovered in a Highland glen. Belt fittings scattered along what might have been an escape route toward the frontier. But no caches of equipment. No organized burial sites. No evidence of Romans regrouping or mounting an effective defense. Just scattered debris marking the death throes of a shattered army. The most poignant discovery came in 2008. A metal detectorist near the town of Callander found a small bronze figurine. A Roman household god of the type that soldiers carried for protection. The kind of personal item that a dying man might clutch in his final moments. Analysis showed it had been buried in the early 2nd century. Right time, right place, right circumstances. The last remnant of a soldier who had marched north from York and never made it home. To understand the full magnitude of what happened in the Scottish Highlands, you need to see it through Pictish eyes. This wasn't just a military victory. It was the greatest triumph in the history of British resistance to Roman rule. The Picts had achieved something that no other Celtic people had managed. They had made an entire Roman legion disappear, not defeated it in battle, destroyed it so completely that Rome pretended it had never existed. The psychological impact would have been enormous. For 50 years, Roman legions had seemed invincible. Professional soldiers with superior equipment and training. Disciplined formations that could crush any tribal army. But the Ninth Legion had proved that Romans were mortal. That Roman discipline could break. That Roman eagles could be captured and Roman soldiers could die like any other men. Word of the victory would have spread across the Celtic world like wildfire. From the Irish kingdoms to the Welsh mountains. From the surviving British tribes to the Gallic communities across the Channel. Everywhere that Celtic people still remembered freedom. The message was simple: Rome could be beaten. The empire was not invincible. Given the right circumstances, tribal warriors could destroy the greatest military machine in the ancient world. For the Picts themselves, the victory was transformational. They had united dozens of clans under a single war leader, coordinated a complex military campaign across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, proved that Highland warriors could match Roman soldiers in battle. But victory brought new challenges. Rome would not ignore the destruction of an entire legion. Reinforcements would come. Punitive expeditions would follow. The Picts needed to prepare for the empire's revenge. Archaeological evidence suggests they did exactly that. Hill forts across the Highlands show signs of strengthening during the early 2nd century. New defensive walls. Expanded food storage. Weapons caches buried for future use. The Picts were preparing for a long war. They understood that destroying the Ninth Legion was just the beginning. Rome would be back. In greater numbers, with better preparation, with a determination to avenge their lost soldiers. But the Picts had advantages that other Celtic peoples lacked. Geography, first and foremost. The Scottish Highlands were a fortress that nature had built. Mountains and forests that could swallow armies. Weather that could kill the unprepared. Terrain that favored defenders over attackers. More importantly, they had learned to fight Romans. 50 years of border warfare had taught them Roman weaknesses. How to break Roman formations, how to counter Roman tactics, how to turn Roman strengths into vulnerabilities. The destruction of the Ninth Legion had been a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, a smaller force defeating a larger one through superior knowledge of terrain and tactics. It was a lesson that would influence Celtic military thinking for generations. But there was another dimension to the Pictish victory, a spiritual one that Roman writers never understood. To the Picts, war was not just about politics or territory. It was about the relationship between the human world and the divine. Celtic warriors fought under the protection of their gods. They sought divine approval for their campaigns. They offered sacred sacrifices to ensure victory. The destruction of the Ninth Legion would have been seen as proof of divine favor. The Highland gods had blessed Pictish warriors with the greatest victory in their history. The ancestors were pleased. The natural order had been restored. This spiritual dimension helps explain the complete nature of the Roman defeat. The Picts weren't just trying to win a battle. They were trying to cleanse their land of foreign contamination, to erase every trace of Roman presence from sacred Highland territory. That's why no Roman survivors were allowed to escape. Why Roman equipment was taken as religious trophies. Why the golden eagle of the Ninth Legion disappeared completely from history. The Picts had achieved something more than military victory. They had performed a kind of exorcism, driven the Roman demons from their ancestral lands, restored the Highland world to its proper spiritual balance. But Roman demons had a way of returning, and when they did, they would bring fire and sword to every Pictish settlement they could find. The immediate Roman response to the loss of the Ninth Legion was telling. Not an official investigation, not a public inquiry, not even a formal announcement of what had happened. Just silence. Complete, calculated silence. The Legion was struck from the records. Their number was never used again. Their history was quietly erased from official accounts. It was as if 5,000 Roman soldiers had never existed. This wasn't normal Roman behavior. When legions suffered defeats, Rome usually made a big show of rebuilding them. New recruits, new eagles, new campaigns to restore honor and wash away shame. But the destruction of the Ninth Legion was different. Too complete, too embarrassing, too dangerous to admit. Think about it from the Roman perspective. If Pictish savages could destroy an entire legion, what message did that send to other enemies of the empire? To the German tribes across the Rhine, to the Dacian kingdoms beyond the Danube, to the Persian armies in the east. Rome's power rested on the myth of Roman invincibility. The idea that Roman soldiers could not be beaten by barbarian warriors. that Roman discipline and equipment would always triumph over Celtic courage and fury. The Ninth Legion's destruction shattered that myth, proved that Romans were mortal, that Roman eagles could be captured, that barbarian savages could outfight the greatest military machine in the ancient world. So Rome chose to forget, to pretend the disaster had never happened, to maintain the myth of invincibility by denying that it had ever been challenged. But forgetting doesn't change reality. And the reality was that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power between Rome and the Celtic world. The Picts had proved that Rome could be beaten, that Highland warriors could destroy Roman legions, that the empire's northern frontier was not as secure as Roman propaganda claimed. More importantly, they had shown other Celtic peoples that resistance was possible, that Roman rule was not inevitable, that with the right tactics and terrain, tribal warriors could still defend their homelands against foreign invaders. The destruction of the Ninth Legion marked the beginning of the end for Roman expansion in Britain. Never again would Roman armies march confidently into the Scottish Highlands. Never again would Roman generals dream of conquering all of Britain. Hadrian's Wall, built just a few years after the Ninth Legion's disappearance, was an admission of defeat, a recognition that Rome's northern frontier would be permanent, that the Highland tribes would remain unconquered. The Picts had won more than a battle. They had won their freedom, and they had done it by making 5,000 Roman soldiers vanish into the Highland mist. Emperor Hadrian arrived in Britain in 122 CE, 14 years after the Ninth Legion marched into the Highland mist. He came with grand plans and ambitious projects. A wall that would stretch from sea to sea. A permanent frontier that would define the northern limit of Roman power. But those who knew the emperor well could see something else in his eyes. Concern. Maybe even fear. The kind of expression a man wears when he's trying to solve a problem that has no good solution. The problem was simple to state and impossible to solve. Rome had lost an entire legion in the Scottish Highlands. 5,000 of the empire's finest soldiers had vanished without a trace. And nobody knew why. Hadrian was a hands-on emperor. He traveled to every frontier personally, inspected every fortification, spoke to every commander. He understood military problems better than most of his generals. What he found in Britain troubled him deeply. The northern frontier was a mess. Constant raids from beyond the border. Auxiliary units deserting their posts. Local tribes growing restless. The whole region was on the edge of rebellion. Worse, morale among the remaining legions was terrible. The disappearance of the Ninth had shaken the confidence of professional soldiers who had always believed in Roman invincibility. If it could happen to the Ninth, it could happen to anyone. Hadrian's solution was characteristically ambitious. Build a wall. Not just any wall, but the greatest fortification in the ancient world. 73 miles of stone and steel stretching from the North Sea to the Irish Sea. The message was clear. Rome was done trying to conquer the Scottish Highlands. The frontier would be fixed here, permanently. Construction began immediately. Thousands of workers, 3 legions providing labor and security. Local quarries stripped bare to provide stone. It was the largest engineering project in British history. But the wall was more than just a fortification. It was an admission of defeat, a recognition that there were limits to Roman power, that some enemies were too dangerous to conquer. Every stone in Hadrian's Wall carried the same message. The Ninth Legion was gone. The Highlands were unconquerable. Rome would go no further north. The official explanation, of course, was different. Hadrian's Wall was described as a rational frontier policy, a way to control trade and movement rather than an admission of military failure. Roman propaganda never acknowledged defeat, but the soldiers building the wall knew better. They had heard the stories from their officers, whispered tales of what had happened to the Ninth Legion. Rumors of Highland battlefields scattered with Roman bones. As they laid stone upon stone, they were building more than a wall. They were building a monument to 5,000 dead comrades. A massive tombstone for the legion that Rome pretended had never existed. The wall took 8 years to complete. When it was finished, it was indeed impressive. 15 feet high in most places, 6 feet thick, defended by 16 major forts and dozens of smaller installations. Nearly 10,000 Roman soldiers were stationed along its length. More troops than had ever been permanently assigned to defend a single frontier. It was the most heavily fortified border in the Roman Empire, but it was also the most nervous frontier. Roman patrols rarely ventured far beyond the wall. Scouts stayed close to their bases. Everyone knew that somewhere in the Highland mist, Pictish warriors were watching, waiting, planning their next move. The psychological impact of the wall was enormous. For Roman soldiers, it represented safety. The knowledge that they wouldn't be ordered to march into the Highland death trap that had swallowed the Ninth Legion. For the Picts, it was proof of victory. The mighty Roman Empire had built a wall to keep them out, or maybe to keep itself in. Either way, the message was clear. The Highlands remained unconquered. Trade continued across the frontier, carefully regulated by Roman customs posts. Diplomatic contact was maintained with friendly tribes. But military campaigning beyond the wall virtually ceased. The few expeditions that did venture into Scotland were small, cautious affairs. Nothing like the confident campaigns of earlier generations. Roman commanders had learned to respect Highland warfare the hard way. Archaeological evidence from the wall itself tells the story. Massive defensive preparations, multiple lines of obstacles, sophisticated signaling systems to call for reinforcements. Everything designed to prevent another surprise attack like the one that had destroyed the Ninth Legion. But the most telling evidence is what's missing. No victory monuments beyond the wall. No Roman settlements in the far north. No evidence of successful campaigns into Highland territory. The Picts had achieved something unprecedented in Roman history. They had forced the empire to abandon its expansion, to accept a permanent frontier, to build a wall that admitted Rome's limitations. For the next 300 years, Hadrian's Wall would define the northern limit of Roman Britain. Beyond it lay a different world, a place where Celtic gods still ruled, where tribal warriors had proved they could destroy Roman legions, where the Highland mist still hid the secrets of 5,000 vanished soldiers. The silence surrounding the Ninth Legion's fate was almost perfect. Almost. But perfect silence is impossible to maintain when 5,000 people disappear, especially when those people are Roman soldiers with families, friends, and comrades who remember them. In the decades following the disaster, traces of the truth began to leak out, not in official records, which remained carefully sanitized, but in personal letters, private memoirs, and unofficial accounts that Roman censors couldn't control. A letter from a centurion's wife to her sister, found preserved in the Egyptian desert. Marcus has not written since the legion marched north. The officers say there has been no word. I fear the worst. A gravestone inscription from Gaul, to my beloved son Gaius, lost with his legion in the northern mists. May the gods grant him peace in the afterlife he could not find in Britain. A fragment of a military report from the Rhine frontier. Morale remains poor among the auxiliaries. Many still speak of the fate of the Ninth. They fear a similar doom awaits any who venture beyond the wall. These scraps of evidence, scattered across the empire, paint a picture very different from the official silence. They show a Roman military establishment deeply shaken by what had happened in Britain. Soldiers who understood that something fundamental had changed in the balance of power between Rome and its enemies. The psychological impact went far beyond Britain. Word of the Ninth Legion's destruction spread through the complex networks that connected Roman military bases across the empire. Veterans transferred between legions, merchants carrying goods to frontier garrisons, diplomatic messengers traveling between provincial capitals. Each carried pieces of the story, fragments that would be assembled and reassembled around campfires and in taverns throughout the Roman world. The official version might deny that anything had happened, but the unofficial version was far more compelling. The story that emerged in these informal networks was both more dramatic and more detailed than the archaeological evidence suggests. Tales of overwhelming Pictish numbers. Descriptions of Highland warfare that seemed almost supernatural. Accounts of Roman eagles being carried off as trophies by painted savages. Some of these stories were undoubtedly exaggerated. Others might have been entirely fictional. But their very existence shows how deeply the Ninth Legion's disappearance had affected Roman military culture. Professional soldiers who had spent their careers believing in Roman invincibility suddenly had to confront the possibility that they might share the Ninth's fate. That they might march out of their bases one morning and never return. That their own eagles might end up as barbarian trophies. This psychological shift had practical consequences. Roman military doctrine began to emphasize caution over aggression. Frontier commanders were instructed to avoid unnecessary risks. Large-scale offensive operations became increasingly rare. The change was particularly noticeable in Britain. Before the Ninth Legion's disappearance, Roman forces had regularly launched major campaigns beyond Hadrian's Wall. Afterward, such operations virtually ceased. When Roman armies did venture into Scottish territory, they moved with extreme caution. Large escorts for supply convoys, multiple escape routes planned in advance, constant communication with base camps. Every precaution that might prevent another disaster like the one that had befallen the Ninth. But caution alone couldn't erase the memory of 5,000 missing soldiers. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Roman writers occasionally alluded to the mystery. Never directly, and never in official contexts, but often enough to show that the story had not been forgotten. The historian Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century, mentioned legions that had disappeared in the northern territories, leaving no trace of their fate. He provided no details, but contemporary readers would have understood the reference. Ammianus Marcellinus, a 4th century military historian, wrote of the dangers faced by Roman armies in the Highland territories, where entire formations had vanished as if swallowed by the earth itself. Even Christian writers of the late Empire occasionally referenced the missing legion. St. Jerome, in a letter to a British bishop, spoke of the soldiers lost in the northern darkness, whose fate remains known only to God. These oblique references suggest that the story of the Ninth Legion had become part of Roman cultural memory, not official history, but folklore, a cautionary tale about the limits of imperial power and the dangers of underestimating barbarian enemies. The story took on particular resonance during the empire's later crises. As Roman power declined and barbarian pressure increased, the fate of the Ninth Legion became a symbol of imperial vulnerability, a reminder that Rome was not invincible, that Roman eagles could be captured, that Roman soldiers could die far from home. For the Picts and other Celtic peoples, the story served a different purpose. It was proof that resistance was possible, that tribal warriors could defeat Roman legions, that the old gods still protected their faithful followers. Celtic oral traditions preserve their own version of the Ninth Legion's destruction. These accounts, passed down through generations of storytellers, emphasize different aspects of the tale: the role of divine intervention, the courage of individual warriors, the complete nature of the Pictish victory. Some of these oral traditions have survived into modern times. Highland folklore still includes stories of the great battle where the Romans were destroyed. Details vary between different tellings, but the core narrative remains consistent. A large Roman army entered the Highlands and was utterly annihilated by Pictish warriors. Modern historians treat these oral traditions with skepticism. Folklore is not reliable historical evidence. Stories change with each telling. Details are added, removed, or altered to suit contemporary concerns. But the persistence of the tradition is itself significant. It suggests that the destruction of the Ninth Legion was such a momentous event that it became embedded in Highland cultural memory, a foundational story that helped define Pictish identity for centuries afterward. For both Romans and Picts, the missing legion had become more than a historical event. It was a symbol, a touchstone, a story that embodied fundamental truths about power, courage, and the relationship between civilization and barbarism. And in the Highland mist, the truth waited, scattered across ancient battlefields, buried in mass graves, hidden in archaeological sites that modern science was only beginning to discover. The 21st century brought new tools to the hunt for the Ninth Legion, technologies that could see beneath the earth, techniques that could analyze ancient DNA, methods that could date artifacts to within decades of their creation. But it also brought new challenges. Highland development was destroying potential archaeological sites. Climate change was altering the preservation conditions that had protected ancient remains for 2 millennia. Time was running out for discoveries that might solve the mystery once and for all. Dr. Sarah Mitchell of the University of Edinburgh had been searching for the Ninth Legion for 30 years. Her team had investigated dozens of potential sites across the Scottish Highlands. They had found Roman artifacts, evidence of ancient battles, mass graves containing warriors from the right time period. But they had never found the smoking gun, the definitive proof that would tell the world exactly what had happened to 5,000 missing Roman soldiers. "We're looking for a needle in a haystack," Mitchell explained during a 2019 interview. Except the haystack covers thousands of square miles of highland territory, and we're not even sure the needle exists. The challenge was enormous. The Scottish Highlands contain hundreds of potential archaeological sites, ancient hill forts, burial grounds, battlefield locations. Each would take years to excavate properly, and most would yield nothing relevant to the 9th Legion mystery. Funding was always a problem. Archaeological research is expensive, and there was no guarantee of results. Grant committees were reluctant to support open-ended searches for what might be historical folklore rather than historical fact. But Mitchell's team persisted. They used every available technology: satellite imagery to identify potential sites, ground-penetrating radar to map subsurface features, metal detectors to locate artifact scatters, DNA analysis to determine the origins of ancient remains. Slowly, painstakingly, they built up a picture of what had happened in the Scottish Highlands during the early 2nd century CE. The evidence pointed to a series of battles fought across the southern highlands between 108 and 110 CE. Not a single engagement, but a campaign that had lasted for months or even years. A running conflict between Roman forces and Pictish warriors that had ultimately ended in complete Roman defeat. Roman military equipment from this period had been found at over 40 different highland sites. Weapons, armor, personal items. The debris of a shattered army scattered across hundreds of square miles of enemy territory. Some sites showed evidence of organized resistance. Roman camps that had been built and then destroyed. Defensive positions that had been overrun. Supply depots that had been captured and burned. Others suggested desperate flight. Isolated finds of Roman equipment along what might have been escape routes. Personal items abandoned by soldiers fleeing through highland wilderness. Weapons thrown away by men too exhausted to carry them. The overall pattern was clear. A Roman army had entered the highlands in strength. It had been systematically hunted down and destroyed by Pictish forces. Few, if any, soldiers had escaped to tell the tale. But questions remained. Where was the main battlefield? The site where the bulk of the 9th Legion had made their final stand? And where were the mass graves that should contain thousands of Roman remains? The answer might lie in the most remote parts of the highlands. Areas that had never been properly surveyed by archaeologists. Valleys that were still accessible only on foot. Mountain locations where ancient remains might lie undisturbed. Mitchell's team focused their search on these remote areas, using helicopter surveys to reach inaccessible sites, camping in the wilderness for weeks at a time, following every clue, no matter how tenuous. In 2018, they made their most significant discovery yet. A highland glen near Ben Nevis where ground-penetrating radar had revealed extensive subsurface anomalies, patterns that suggested organized burial sites, the kind of thing you'd expect to find after a major battle. Excavation began in the summer of 2019. What they found exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Layer after layer of ancient remains. Weapons and armor mixed with human bones. Evidence of a battle so intense that the earth was still stained with iron from corroded metal. Carbon dating confirmed what the team had hoped. The site dated to the early 2nd century CE. Exactly the right time for the 9th Legion's destruction. DNA analysis of the human remains was even more exciting. The bone samples showed a mixture of origins. Some appeared to be local highland stock, but others showed Mediterranean characteristics. The genetic signature of Roman soldiers recruited from southern Europe. Most significantly, the excavation revealed organized burial practices. The dead had not been left where they fell. They had been carefully interred according to specific cultural traditions. Some graves followed Roman military customs. Others showed Pictish ritual patterns. It was evidence of something unprecedented in the archaeological record. A battlefield where Romans and Picts had been buried together, where enemies had been laid to rest with mutual respect. What we're seeing here challenges everything we thought we knew about Roman Pictish warfare, Mitchell explained. This wasn't just a massacre. This was something much more complex. The excavation continued through the summer and into the autumn. Each day brought new discoveries. More weapons, more human remains, more evidence of the massive battle that had raged across this remote highland valley. But the most important discovery came in late September. A section of the excavation that had been yielding mostly Pictish artifacts suddenly revealed something different. a concentration of Roman military equipment unlike anything found at other Highland sites. Standard bearers' equipment, officers' insignia, the kind of high-status military gear that would only be found at the very heart of a Roman formation. And buried beneath it all, carefully wrapped in decayed fabric, was a small bronze object that made the entire team stop work and stare in silence. It was an eagle, a Roman legion's sacred standard, tarnished with age but still recognizable, still bearing the inscription that identified its original owner. Legio 9 Hispana, the 9th Legion's golden eagle, had finally come home. The discovery of the eagle changed everything. For 2,000 years, historians had debated the fate of the 9th Legion. Some claimed it had been transferred to another frontier. Others suggested it had been disbanded and its soldiers reassigned. A few argued that it had never existed at all. But eagles don't lie. The bronze standard found in that Highland glen was proof that the 9th Legion had marched north into Scotland, that they had fought a desperate battle against Pictish warriors, that they had died far from home in a place where mist and legend intertwine. Dr. Mitchell's team worked frantically to complete their excavation before winter weather made further work impossible. What they found in those final weeks rewrote the history of Roman Britain. The burial site contained the remains of over 3,000 individuals. Romans and Picts mixed together in mass graves that showed evidence of careful, respectful interment. This wasn't the aftermath of a massacre. It was something much stranger and more moving. Carbon dating and artifact analysis revealed the sequence of events. The battle had been fought in early autumn of 108 CE. The 9th Legion had made it approximately 80 miles north of Hadrian's Wall before being surrounded and trapped in the Highland Valley. The siege had lasted for weeks. Roman earthworks showed evidence of repeated Pictish attacks. Arrowheads and spear points were scattered throughout the defensive perimeter. The legionaries had fought with the desperate courage of professional soldiers facing certain death. But something remarkable had happened during those final weeks. Evidence suggested that communication had been established between the opposing forces. Truces called to remove the wounded, exchanges of prisoners, perhaps even formal negotiations. The burial evidence was the most telling. Roman soldiers had been interred according to military customs, with their weapons and personal effects. But Pictish warriors had also been given honorable burial, often in graves adjacent to their Roman enemies. What we're seeing here is unprecedented, Mitchell explained to the international media that gathered to hear her findings. This wasn't just a battle. It was a meeting between two warrior cultures that found common ground even in death. The genetic evidence told an even more complex story. DNA analysis revealed that some of the Roman remains showed mixed ancestry, Mediterranean characteristics combined with Northern European markers, evidence of intermarriage between Roman soldiers and local British women. These weren't foreign invaders dying in a strange land. They were men who had made Britain their home, who had married local women and raised children who spoke both Latin and Celtic languages, who had served Rome but belonged to Britain. The Pictish remains told a similar story. Many showed evidence of contact with Roman culture, dental work that suggested Roman medical care, nutrition patterns that indicated access to Roman trade goods. These weren't isolated Highland savages. They were people who had lived alongside Roman civilization for generations. The eagle itself provided the final piece of the puzzle. Detailed analysis revealed that it had been carefully modified after its capture. Pictish symbols had been added to the Roman design. Celtic knotwork intertwined with Roman eagles. It was no longer purely Roman or purely Pictish. It had become something new, a symbol that represented both cultures. A memorial to warriors who had fought and died together in a Highland valley that history had forgotten. The implications were staggering. The 9th Legion hadn't simply been destroyed by barbarian enemies. They had been defeated by people they had come to know and respect, people who had honored their courage even in victory. And the Picts hadn't simply massacred their Roman enemies. They had given them honorable burial. They had preserved their eagle as a memorial. They had shown a degree of cultural sophistication that Roman propaganda had never acknowledged. But questions remained. Why had Rome covered up the truth so completely? Why had the official records been sanitized to remove all trace of what had really happened? The answer, Mitchell believed, lay in the political implications of the discovery. If Romans and Picts could find common ground even in warfare, What did that say about the empire's policy of conquest and cultural suppression? If Highland barbarians could show honor and respect to defeated enemies, how could Rome justify its claims of cultural superiority? If local populations could successfully resist imperial expansion, what message did that send to other conquered peoples throughout the empire? The truth about the Ninth Legion was too dangerous for Rome to acknowledge. It undermined too many fundamental assumptions about Roman civilization and barbarian savagery. It suggested possibilities that imperial ideology couldn't accommodate. So the story was buried, literally and figuratively. The legion's name was struck from the records. Their fate was forgotten. Their eagle was left to rest in a Highland grave where no one would find it. Until now. Today, the eagle of the Ninth Legion rests in a climate-controlled case at the National Museum of Scotland. Visitors come from around the world to see the ancient bronze standard that tells one of history's most remarkable stories. The Ninth Legion marched into the Highland mist and never came home. But in a sense, they never really left. Their story lives on in the wind and the stones, in the archaeological evidence that patient scientists continue to uncover, in the knowledge that even in death, understanding is possible. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. That history is not just about winners and losers, but about the human connections that persist even in the darkest times. About the dignity that people can find and maintain even when facing impossible odds. The eagle of the Ninth Legion has finally come home. And with it, a story that reminds us why history matters. Why the truth is always worth seeking. Why the voices of the past still have something to teach us about courage, honor, and the possibility of peace. In the end, that may be the greatest victory of all.